Welcome to The Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of nonbeliever who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have, so be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you. Pops.
Yo.
I'm kind of excited about this show.
That makes one of us.
Good to know. It's definitely been, I feel like we keep saying this, but I think this is just going to be the theme for the whole summer. Like, it has definitely been a couple of weeks since we recorded.
Yeah. It's been a bit busy in the brain.
Very busy in the brain. And it's so funny because in the last episode, we talked a lot about, being wrong and being more honest about when things are hard and where we need support. And I feel like it was just kind of the perfect week for all of that. I don't know, at least personally, because for multiple reasons, you and I have been under a certain amount of stress. And everybody I talked to kind of asked about how the boys were doing. And whenever it came up, I'm like, they're doing amazing, but at a certain point that has to have an impact on them, even if they just sort of feel the vibe in the room. And so I, told everybody, like, I fully expected and was sort of prepared for them to have some hard moments. And then it wasn't awful by any means, but I feel like it was a little bit of a trying week where they were just kind of at each other's throats a little bit more than normal, and tensions were kind of high. And despite knowing that would 100% happen and being mentally prepared for it, I still wasn't mentally prepared for it.
Right. Yeah.
I was like, wow, I've been telling people for weeks, I know this is going to happen. This is totally natural. And then when it did, it still felt really hard.
Well, think about this. You have no way of knowing if it wouldn't have felt harder had you not thought about it ahead of time, if you had not meditated on the various ins and outs and what have yous of how the stress would impact the boys and their relationship with each other. We can always just sit back and say, oh, that's what did happen. But, it's sometimes harder to appreciate what our efforts prevented because we didn't experience that.
That's a really good point. I think for me in this past week, kind of the biggest time, I read to the boys before bed every night. Mm-hmm. And I fully, I know it's really good to read to your kids, yada, 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 but I fully know that this is something I do for myself. And
it's good to hear you say that.
I love reading to them. I will read to them until they push me out of the room. I don't know. It's something very special to me. I do think they enjoy it for the most part.
For the most part.
If one of them gets surly and walks out of the room, if I keep reading to the other one, the kid who is left gets very, very mad that I would deign to read when they've left, even though they were the one who left. But it can be a time. I mean, it's looked a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's very sweet and all of us cuddling together on the bed while I read. And more
sometimes
often,
it sounds like from downstairs, it sounds like you guys are doing elephant parkour. It's so loud from how they're jumping off the bed and running around and wrestling and playing basketball, full contact or whatever it is they do. It's insane the amount of activity that seems to happen in and around reading.
Yeah. And I I feel like, kind of allowing it. And a lot of those times I don't have a problem with that. Like if
To your
they
credit.
if they can be playing soccer or like leaping from the bed onto one of our, onto a pile of blankets or like one of our, what do you call the kick things?
A kick shield.
Kick shields, one of the kick shields. If they're listening, like I am cool with it. I think part of like recognizing that this is for me is kind of acknowledging that like they can also make it work for them how they want to make it work. But what doesn't work is when they are really arguing with each other, like then it all falls apart because you can't argue with somebody and listen to a story at the same time. And that was just like a lot of what it was earlier in the week. And I just did like the laziest thing of just like telling them to stop talking and to be quiet, which never works. And it felt so impossible. And yeah, it was just really, and we're reading the fourth book in the Mysterious Benedict Society, which is kind of the last one with the main group of kids. And we've loved the series. And if anybody's reading it, like the first two are really fun, but the third book just takes it to like such an amazing different level. I feel like they really kind of hit their stride on the third, and the fourth is also just so lovely. And so I know, like, we've definitely read books where like they weren't as into them, but I know that they like the series. So I just like, this is the end of it. And so if they can get it together, like I know they care about hearing what happens. So it was just, if it was a story that like I knew they had kind of checked out of, I don't think I would have even cared that much. Cause like if they didn't really hear some of it, whatever, fine. But I know they care about this one. So it was also feeling that. And I don't know. I don't even know how we got it back together. I think, earlier in the week, I told them that like, then we weren't going to do anything during reading and they just had to listen. And I don't know if that would have even worked. That just kind of pissed him off. But somehow we've just kind of fallen back into something that works. I think totally unrelated to anything I was trying to do, but it's been a little bit of a time. How did the week feel for you?
I don't know how many panic attacks I staved off, but we are in the process of moving, meaning that I'm doing basically the majority of the work on that. And it's a lot to keep track of. It's another big move. And it's for us, another international move. And it's difficult because I'm also trying to keep up with my work on the side and making sure the boys feel like they're being attended to well. And I feel like I've been pulled in a lot of different directions, even though it's just one more direction. But there are so many discrete tasks and so many like such an interconnected series of steps involved in us exiting our current home and moving to our next, that it can feel overwhelming. But what really helped is us going through the basement yesterday and starting the process of figuring out what stays and what goes. But also that I, through the course of this week, now have a much better sense of what to expect when it comes to the movers and also our house cleaning situation. And so it was a lot of stuff where I knew what I had to do in order to regulate my state of mind, but I was having just a very hard time of actually doing it. And it ended up well, but it was a bit of struggle this week. But it's nice now, and we have a much better plan, and I feel like we've pushed past a few initial hurdles. And so it's good. We're off to the races. I like having a sense of what I can do at each phase now better than I did before. And that ability to plan really helps me. Part of my anxiety revolves around that difficulty when it comes to my schedule changing or not being able to plan. So I think that was part of it, that there were so many nebulous factors that were sort of bouncing off of each other. And now there are fewer factors, and the timing of the deployment of our solutions to each of those factors is much better known. So, but yes, it was a week.
It was a week. Do you think it impacted your time with the boys at all, or did you feel like you were able to keep it separate?
I mean, of course I try to keep it separate. I'm sure it impacted. I did my best to listen to them. There are moments where I had to actually physically tell myself, no, you love them. They deserve a better solution to their argument. Cause, like you said, they had a bit of a stressful time too. Mm-hmm. And so there were a couple of times this week when I had to talk with them when we're on the way to school or coming home from school or on our way to or from their MMA classes after school, and helping them sort out solutions between each other or expectations they might have for themselves. But it did feel like that part felt extra strenuous this week, just because I felt like I didn't have as much energy as I would typically have for them.
Parenting is just, I think one of the things that makes it so challenging is that you can sometimes get away with kind of half-assing it. But I feel like kids just sort of they can feel when you're not all there.
Oh yeah.
And it just if you're not bringing your best, there's not the leeway. You really feel it. Sometimes it's fine, but sometimes you can really feel it when you're oh yeah, they just know that my A game is not on. And if you don't have, kind of the wherewithal and energy to connect to that A game, it can just be so apparent.
No, for sure. They're sharks. They smell blood.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. So for our first topic, I have noticed something, and I am curious on your thoughts about it. So I'm in a couple secular parenting groups online, and I've started to see a trend in a couple of the posts, which I think is interesting, particularly around, I think I've seen more lately because Easter happened recently. And it takes a couple different forms, but kind of the general theme is, oh, I was in this store, or we passed something, and my kid saw a picture of Jesus and didn't know who it was. And I am so glad about that. So around Easter, a picture of Jesus reading to a group of children and being oh, who's the funny man with a long beard? And kind of oh, I felt so good that they didn't even recognize who that was. And I've just seen enough of them that I think this is an interesting thing. So I'm wondering how you respond to that, Pops.
Well, first, regarding Jesus, I was just reading the script to the film The Northman.
Mm-hmm.
And I have yet to see the film. I know, I should. But at one point, one character refers to Jesus as the corpse god.
So good.
With a hyphen in lowercase, your corpse god.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to stick with me forever. So when I think of pictures of Jesus regarding Easter, I think of zombie Jesus riding a mechanized giant flame-spitting Easter bunny with like snappy Mechagodzilla jaws laying waste to a small city.
Mm-hmm.
That's my Easter picture of Jesus. Now, but in all seriousness, we talked about this yesterday. I am not a fan of, and no offense to anybody out there who might totally disagree with me, but personally, I would not be a fan of my kids not knowing a picture of Jesus. Similarly, I would want my kids to be able to recognize depictions of many gods, Kali and Ganesh and, Odin or Hermes or whoever, Quetzalcoatl. And I just want, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I think I am. And it's so fascinating, human myth making, that not knowing about various depictions or histories or significances relative within the culture or the religion, like not knowing that stuff for my kids from the standpoint of me loving storytelling so much, like I would feel like a failed parent if my kids didn't at least know who so-and-so was, especially when they live in a culture where so many people they're going to come into contact with are going to care. So, I don't want to offend anybody out there. You're going to raise your kids how you raise your kids. But personally, I want my kids to know what Jesus looks like so they can go into somebody's house, see a picture of Ewan McGregor from, the Clone Wars on the wall and say, hey, nice picture of Jesus, and see if the person who hung it actually knows it's Ewan McGregor.
Indeed. I mean, I think the side where I totally get it is if you were raised in a community that is predominantly Christian.
Yep.
And if you feel like you were really indoctrinated as a child into the Christian faith.
Yeah.
I totally get feeling, like,
oh yeah.
I don't think that was really, I mean, I know you were raised Christian, but I don't feel like it was that
I mean,
kind of
I went
like,
through my angry atheist thing too. Like I was resentful at feeling like I had been lied to. Not necessarily like because the people that I participated in the religion with were intentionally like they knew it was fake and they were telling me to believe anyway. No, it's like it's something that we all participated in. But as I exited it, I realized that in not being able to know if it's true or not, that I felt like I had been deceived in the culture and the book and all of it, like collaborating to tell me that it actually is to be believed as true. And but bitterness can be like, bitterness should be accepted and it should be forgiven, right? Like that's why I'm not going to tell anybody not to do that, because like if you hear your kid say, who is that, when they're looking at a picture of Jesus, and you're like, effing A, right, I've succeeded as a parent. And that comes from, trauma, right? In some degree, like, I mean, absolutely you're entitled to feel that way. And I'm not going to judge you for that.
Well, and I also think, like we've talked about it, I know a lot of people who stepped away from a religion and then once they had kids felt like, am I supposed to go back to this?
Yeah.
Like, and did. And I know several people who did. And one of my big reasons for starting the podcast was because I just felt like if you really feel like that's what's best for your family and that's what you want to do, as long as you're not going back to one of the really toxic versions of religion, like I'm not going to tell you what to do with your family. But I feel like a lot of people do that because they just don't have a picture in their heads of how to raise kids differently and don't think
that's true.
and don't think they're going to be able to figure out ways to teach morality and other things without a religious context. And so one of the big reasons I wanted to talk about it, not that we do it all right, but was to just sort of say, like, look, there are other ways to think about this, and there are other ways to muddle through, and it can be done if that's what you want to do. So if you grew up in that kind of community, and if you've seen a lot of your friends who maybe weren't as religious, in their 20s and go back to church when they had kids, I think it definitely makes sense to be proud of, like, I didn't do that. Like, I had no, it can be very hard to figure out how to parent when you're doing it very differently than you were raised. And so I 100% get being super proud of, like, so many people I know, like, just didn't try to figure it out a new way, like, weren't brave enough to take that step. And I did it. Like, I am parenting without religion. And like you said, like, fuck yeah, my kid doesn't even know who Jesus is. Like, I think that's totally legit, and I get it. Also, there may be an edge to it that, like, I'm not catching in some of these posts, where maybe these parents have told their kids a lot about Jesus, but just because it's not the center of the family, it's not the first thing they think of. And in that instance, I'm like, yeah, that is super cool. Like, if that's not the first thing that comes to mind, like, you've kept your kids out of that being, like, the center of existence. Like, again, yeah, fabulous. Feel great about that. But I do think, yes, storytelling. And also there is, for a lot of countries, Christianity is still the basis of a lot, Yep. And I think I have definitely wanted to make sure the boys know about it, because even if I don't think the Bible is sort of the be all that a lot of other people do, like, a lot of art I do care about references it, because it's like a huge cultural touch point.
Absolutely.
Politics still, because everything sucks. Like, people are still making that the basis of, like, legal cases, and they need to understand what's going on there. And, and I think also, certainly already, like, their friends have brought up stuff to them. And I'd rather they not hear about things first from somebody else. I'd rather we at least have given them some context for those stories and what people bring up to them. So I can see, do you know what's really funny about all this, though?
What?
Which I was thinking about? Because, like, the first 5 episodes we did of the podcast were about the book It's Just God, which I found so challenging and frustrating. And that book was written partially to encourage atheist parents not to be afraid to talk to their kids about religion. So I had so much trouble with that book, but here I am, sort of being equally skeptical about not talking with your kids about religion. But I think I was just thinking about it because I've actually started going back and listening to all of our episodes again, because parenthood has destroyed my memory and I have no idea what we discussed in the past. And I'm also trying to learn and get better. And going back to those episodes, I was like, am I going to feel bad about this? Like, was I just, like, way too hard on this book? And I think it's so funny because, like, long after we did those episodes, I read, we've talked about him before, Dale McGowan, was kind of one of, like, the first writers about atheist parenting. And kind of in this age. And he has a book called Parenting Beyond Belief, which is, like, just a whole set of essays from, like, a huge number of thinkers about, like, every topic you could ever imagine about parenting as a non-believer. And I read the whole thing. And it is, I think, if you are one of those parents who, like, came from a very strong religious upbringing and feel in some instances like you're not sure how to do certain things now that you've stepped away from your faith, I think it's a great book because it just literally, like, how to talk about death, how to talk, like how to teach about science, how to look at morality, how to look at making family traditions. Like it covers everything. As somebody who grew up in a mainly sort of like non-religious household, I didn't talk about it a lot on the podcast because it just felt like I was just like, yeah, no, I mean, like, it almost felt like there was nothing to discuss because it was just like, yeah, you can do that without religion. Oh, yeah, totally. That too. That, and so it felt very, it just felt very obvious to me. And then there's one chapter by the woman who wrote It's Just God. And it made me furious all over again. So I think like an entire book that just seemed like not even worth discussing. I was like, but I think, I think the reason that was so challenging was, to me, the real concern of that book and like why you should teach your kid about Christianity is so, in a lot of instances, like, so your kid can pass. Like, if your kid doesn't want to stand out as an atheist, you have to make sure they know about religion so they can pretend that they're like everybody else. Or if they want to be religious, that you're like not holding them back from being religious. And you're giving them every chance to be religious. And at some point, I think we have to talk about indoctrination because I think we feel very differently about it. But I definitely feel like we should be teaching kids about a lot of religious traditions because they are so important for different societies and culturally, and to understand how we got where we are and to understand references and what other people are thinking about. But like, those are not the reasons that I would prioritize doing it. So in that sense, like, I think the other positive side of what these parents are talking about is like, I guess it's cool that they're also not scared that their kids are going to be out of step. That they're like cool with their kids being who they are. But it's interesting.
So one of the things that I like as a parent is that really kind of awesome responsibility of helping a person that's part of you be the best version of themselves that they can be.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there are so many interesting philosophical and psychological implications to that process, right? But then the whole process being compounded by us as parents in an effort to be good at the job, having to go back and analyze everything we've done wrong, second guessing everything we've done right. Like, that constant stream of self-reflection when you've come from a religious background can make it really hard for you to know really which end is up in some of these questions, which is why it's really cool that there are so many resources online and so many places you can go to talk to people who are still in religion, or have exited religion, who are on their way out, because it's hard enough being a parent without worrying if you're going to ruin your kid's future just based on how much your kid knows about the religion of their community, even if they are themselves not a part of that religion. Like, it's like an extra step that a lot of families who participate in the religion don't appreciate, and probably will never appreciate any of our efforts toward making our kids aware of the religion so they can be respectful.
Mm-hmm.
Because like, we have to talk about this stuff with our kids. I would rather not. I would rather like it not have to be something that we bring up. And then I feel guilty because, we're white and we don't have the same issues with discrimination and racism and disproportionate levels of violence from law enforcement and the things that you see statistically borne out against, brown and black and, folks in America. And we don't have to have those conversations with our kids of, don't do this, don't do that, don't be too much this way, make sure you do this to fit in. Otherwise, that like those sorts of conversations I know families have with their kids across the country in every city and community, like daily. And it breaks my heart, obviously, that it has to happen. But then I feel guilty because we don't have to, like, we have issues as secular folk, but it pales in comparison, obviously, because we're currently not being persecuted currently.
Yeah.
Who knows what will
and
happen?
We also
could end up being Gilead, and then we get hung out from the rafters by our necks until dead.
And also, we've mainly lived in communities where there is not going to be a lot of pushback about us being atheists. And I know for a lot of people, that is unfortunately not the case. They can feel very ostracized because of that. So
yes,
that changes all of the calculus as well.
Yeah, it's basically what it comes down to is we are still an outgroup. We are still from the controlling group. And as such, we have to find that way of participating in our community at large, while also maintaining our sense of identity as secularists, while also teaching our kids that it's okay to maintain their own identities on top of being, if they so desire, being a secular person and what that entails. And then teaching them based on the community we live in, how to fight the power or politely fit in, or just be open with yourself and not worry about pushback because that might be the culture that you're in. It just depends. And then if you move from one place to another, then they sort of have to rewire what they think is appropriate based again on the new culture they find themselves a part of. It would just be a lot easier if we were just Christian, and some form of Christian. And then even if we were still progressive Christians, we could easily hide part of the progressive part of it and just not go to church and say we just pray on our own and, cite some Bible verses and be on our merry way. And they probably wouldn't think, two things of it unless we start talking about politics. Mm-hmm. So it feels like there should be an easier way to do this. But I think that the country is currently so divided culturally and politically that there just is no good way to do this. And you have to do it on a case-by-case basis because some places are just really shitty towards secular folks. Mm-hmm. And some places could be, like blue dots in red states where you can be as progressive as you want and nobody's going to care. So, like you said, I guess being a parent is really hard.
And I feel like that leads into the next topic perfectly, because in some ways we have it easy because at least we are both secular and can kind of, lean on each other to help in these situations and know we have each other's backs. And when one of us, one person starts a conversation about one of these things, the other person can pick it up. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is interfaith couples, because I am curious, do you think you could make this whole parenting thing work if you were with somebody who was a believer?
I mean, can you make this parenting thing work with another human being?
Yeah, it's pretty hard to just at that level. But it definitely adds another thing.
Of course it does. But I bring that up in jest, but it's kind of really true because every person is different. And I think the faith part of it matters less than the person's values. For me personally, being a humanist, there are plenty of religious folks, we talk about this like every week, it seems, plenty of religious folks who are humanists, and we can side with them on all sorts of things that don't have to do with their religion being true or not true. I could easily find myself, so long as she's willing to put up with me, a partner who is still a professing believer of some sort of religion, just so long as she doesn't expect me to participate, and
Mm-hmm.
she doesn't demand that the kids participate. If it's a demand that the kids participate, it's a deal breaker.
Mm.
But if it's like an openness to the kids participating if they want, totally fine with that. Like, ultimately, if if that woman and I are compatible, then I think that the values matter more. And there are other things that I think are more important to the health of a relationship and the efficacy of a pair of people as parents in a household that go beyond religion. Like, we put a lot of emphasis on religion, and hey, we have a secular parenting podcast, but that doesn't mean that that's all I am is a secularist, and it doesn't mean that's all I look for in a partner.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting coming at it from the secular side, because as a non-religious person, like I feel like the stakes are just much lower. So, if somebody else is religious, like, fine. You know what I mean? Like, if someone I love is religious, that's great. That's fine. There's no bad consequences to that, again, unless it's like some terrible form of it that's preaching something awful. But like you said, if it's somebody you love and care about, it's unlikely that they're going to go so far down that kind of rabbit hole. But like, at worst, it's just like some wasted time each week. You know what I mean? So,
But if the person's faith, if your partner's faith is what keeps them being good more often than not and contributing to the health of their community more often than not, and that their faith and their efforts to maintaining their faith and the culture of their religious community motivate them and inspire them to do these things, then it's not wasted time.
yeah, no, I'm saying at worst, like the most negative it would be is wasted time. But yeah, it could be great time. Like, there's wonderful community that comes out of that, volunteer work, all sorts. So then, yeah, on the good side, it's like a positive. But I wonder what it's like for the person on the religious side of that equation, because if you believe certain parts of certain religions, then, you're partially thinking about your partner, like, not going to heaven with you in the afterlife. And like, I don't know how you feel about your kids if they decide to lean more in your partner's way of thinking. That to me seems like a much more challenging position to be in. But then I have to remind myself. So I think it's always interesting talking about religious positions, because we've often talked about it. Like, if I was religious, I feel like I would be a really irritating religious person.
I agree.
Like, really irritating, because
I mean, you're bad enough now and you're not religious. So.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. But I do have to remind myself that there are a lot of people who sort of, who are like very light religious, who just sort of take the good parts and like that it makes them feel good about certain things. And like, it's not a huge defining thing for them. So maybe in that case, it doesn't really feel like a challenge, because there's like, I want my kids to hear some of the stories and to celebrate Christmas. And maybe we go 3 times a year and like, yeah, then maybe it's not a big challenge. But because I would be over the top if I was religious, like, that's immediately where where my brain goes.
Mm.
Because I think, like, if there is a God who cares about what you do in the world, like, how is that not the most, like, important thing there is?
Indeed.
I think it would be challenging. But then I was thinking about it. So remember that Christian couple that I spoke about when we were talking about trad wives?
Yes.
Morgan and Paul, whose last names I can't pronounce. So, because I'm broken, I just listen to their channel for fun sometimes now. It's really hard to explain, and I probably have to work through it like in therapy or something. But so they've started doing a thing where they go and meet with other Christian influencers that have a different perspective as them, kind of trying to like bring together the Christian community and have more understanding for views that aren't the same as theirs. And so they went to talk with one of the two sisters who does this really popular channel called GirlDefined. I haven't followed that channel. I guess they're really popular. They're sort of, people have apparently very strong feelings about them. They've talked a lot about modesty in ways that people do and do not like. One of them got married and has been giving kind of like Christian sex advice, which some people really like and some people have like really given her shit for. Whatever. But I was really interested to watch that one because right after they went and spent time with the creator, her husband announced that he was deconstructing, which is just like, I think I'm like on the record for like, I love squabbles in groups I'm not a part of. Like, I don't know, like I just like it. So I'm terribly fascinated that all this is happening. And it's very interesting to see their interview with them right before that happened, because one thing that Morgan talked with this woman whose name I don't remember from GirlDefined about, because it was very clear that her husband, that though they're both Christian, he was turning to like a much more, liberal isn't the right word, but
Progressive.
Much more progressive form of Christianity than she was. And people actually gave Morgan shit after the interview because the woman was talking about how much she, and this is like the uber, like, oh God, my vagina is just going to seal itself shut and I'm never going to be able to have sex again thing of like, well, I'm so glad he's leading and I just follow his lead. And I'm so happy he's, decided on what church we're going to go to and is, the leader of the family. I'm like, oh, okay, fine. But talked about things she really liked about the Lutheran church he had them change to, and how, even though they see things differently, she thinks he's a really good model for the kids. And Morgan kind of said like, well, I mean, if it works for you, like you guys got to figure that shit out. And people gave Morgan a hard time for being too judgmental. I don't care. Like, I think all these people are wrong about so much. Like, you judge each other, whatever. If you guys were, again, I like internal squabbles. Christians argue with each other all you like. It's fun for me to watch. But it felt like the same argument. It opened my eyes a little bit because I'm like, we think so much about like if people of two different religions are together, but like these are two Christians and they are having as many questions and as much of a struggle, I feel like, as people of two different faiths would, because the issues are almost as stark between these different philosophies as it would be of two different religions. So maybe it's even like a bigger conversation than we normally have it.
Well, part of this is that the sort of like total lay counter apologist in me uses the, Christians argue about this stuff. It's not settled. You guys duke it out, figure out, who's right amongst you first and then get back to me sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's just like, it really is like absurd how many different sects there are of Christianity. And all of them, of course, use the Bible as their basis. All of them, of course, have moral pronouncements that they make. Obviously, I'll side with the more progressive folks, like the red letter folks, who just go by Jesus' words and don't adhere to a lot of like the admonitions that you get from the Old Testament or the New. They just look on the Beatitudes and associated teachings. And that's fine. I don't want to sound reductionist or dismissive, but that is the sense I get from them, is that I obviously side with them culturally, socially, politically. But does that mean that they are the correct version of Christianity? I don't know. Is there a correct version of Christianity? Maybe. And if there is, let that correct version of Christianity be the version of Christianity, and other people like come up with whatever religion they want to, talk about. They want to preach and practice. Because at the end of the day, I care more about, can you show me that it is true and it makes predictions about, us and the universe? And if you can't, it's not going to compel belief, just like somebody else's version of your religion or other religion you're not compelled to believe that. So I'll, check back with me once you guys have sorted it out. Feels like the most appropriate response, but it's hard to say that in a conversation. It's hard to invoke that without sounding dismissive. And I don't want to sound dismissive.
Yeah.
But it just feels like such a dead end conversation for me to have as somebody who's on the outside, because I don't have, like, the only skin I have in the game is that, the more fundamentalist version of Christianity has totally co-opted an entire political wing of the country and is trying to, obviously, we know the drill, doing their thing. And that's really where I feel my burden ends, because anything beyond that is like a doctrinal dispute. And I, like, so long as you don't want trans people to die by inaction or ostracize gay folks, try to annul their marriages, or say that climate change is a hoax, or, want to ban To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever. Like, as long as that isn't happening, you can believe whatever you want, but whichever one is the true one, I don't know. And I don't think it should matter, but it obviously does, because everybody feels like they need to be special. And what I found in monotheistic religions is there is that need for supremacy, like they're mutually exclusive, Like, if you believe in a pantheon already, adding one more god that you just didn't know about is probably a smaller ask than having there be anything other than the one God who shall have no others before him. And so your version necessarily has to be the only one. And so it's like, it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Thinking about this, maybe I'm like the worst person to be in an interfaith relationship. Because if I was with someone who was more just kind of like chill about it, I think like deep down I'd want to be like, but what do you really think? Like, how does it not bother you? How do you?
Mm-hmm.
I would be such trouble. Though I do feel, so Jamilah Lemieux is one of the hosts on Care and Feeding, which is Slate's parenting podcast.
Okay.
And she's writing a book, which I think is going to talk partially about what it's like to be a secular mother in the Black community. Book isn't done yet, so for sure it could change, but she's mentioned it on the show. She mentioned a book that she was reading and really liked called Lip Theology, which I picked up, which is by Candice Marie Benbow. And I feel like maybe I don't know anything about her because I just picked it up because Jamilah suggested it. So she has a very kind of interesting progressive theology. The book does not talk much about that theology. A lot of it is about a minister that she had an affair with, who then treated her terribly. But she talks some about her theology, and I wish she talked about it more, because initially that sort of like, kind of like bad other universe me, who would be that terrible Christian, had a really hard time with it when she started talking about some of her beliefs, because she's like, I don't refer to God as male or female anymore. And look, like if I was making up a God, that makes perfect sense. The fact that any gods are given genders feels real weird to me, because if like you are so amazing that you could make everything that is, the fact that you would fall into that kind of binary, I get it. Like that doesn't make sense. But I don't know how you look at the Bible and say that God isn't gendered. So like I was having real struggles with that. But I picked up another book, so I haven't finished it yet because I'm awful. I got to finish it. But towards the end, she gets into it a little bit more. And she's talking about reading the New Testament. And she does this amazing thing where she's like, well, Paul says this, but like Paul is just this trifling man who is like feeling bad about his own stuff. And so you can see him reading into that, everything that happened. And then my mind exploded and I was like, oh, I want to know so much more about what you're talking about. I feel like, I mean, I don't think I'm ever going to become a Christian, but like, if lightning struck and something weird happened, I feel like she might have saved me from becoming a terrible Christian, because that reading made instant sense, where it was like, all right, this is not fully divinely inspired. I don't know how anybody can claim that to begin with. Like, we got to look at this as, a story being told from different perspectives and like find our own way through it. And it was the first time where I was like, oh, that works. And like, it was the first time where I was like, well, like that version of a Christian, I could be married to that person all day long. Totally get that. I think we could have great discussions and I wouldn't be triggered of like, how are you not worrying about this stuff? Where if I was religious, I would be worrying about this stuff. So that was fascinating. So that I could handle.
Mm.
But I don't think most people are coming from her perspective.
No.
Unfortunately. We could have so many more interesting conversations if that was the kind of theological discussion happening out there.
Well, I think that we could have so many more conversations if that the need for, I have found in discussing, let me backtrack a second. I have found in discussing this sort of thing that I enter into what I think are conversations where the other person clearly just wants to debate, where they want to appeal to emotions, they want to use rhetoric, they want to talk about philosophy, and they want to try to construct syllogisms, and doesn't like none of that speaks to whether or not what you're saying is actually true, because that's determined by soundness, not validity. But beyond that, you're missing an opportunity to actually have a conversation wherein the less acrimonious it is, the more likely the desired result of, with Christians, the Great Commission of be prepared to tell everyone why you believe what you do and its value. And like, you're sort of trampling all over what the Bible claims is so important for a Christian, for a devout Christian, to always be prepared. And so somebody coming to them and saying, hey, I want to talk about this thing. And they say, great. And they sharpen their knives like that. Maybe it's because they feel like there's this whole like Christian persecution thing where maybe they feel like, oh, somebody's dares question my faith. I have to shut them down in the name of Jesus. And I don't know. It just feels like shit's just gotten too heated, man. Like you can't just have a conversation about any of it anymore, whether or not you're in a loving relationship. And I just think it's a giant ball of missed opportunities on the part of the Christians, but also on the part of the secularists. Because if you are a non-believer and your goal is to get to actually know a person's beliefs, then you have to be open to them saying things that you might not like and might contradict what you believe. And that's okay if they do that. You know, so long as they're in the process not harming you or anybody you care about. Conversation is hard.
Oh, yeah. Feels like a great place to wrap it up. And you got to go do Legos with Reader. I
do. And I have to actually start, in retrospect, I have to start dinner earlier.
All right. I will let you go. We need to thank Jonathan Zalbin and First Frame Music for the music for this podcast.
And that wraps up this episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.
Okay, I feel like I might not have fully captured how interesting Lip Theology was in my description of it. So I'm just going to read the 2 paragraphs that blew my mind to give a slightly better feel of it. So this is by Candice Marie Benbow. If you think it's interesting, check it out. Here was what got me. I get the people of David and Paul. They were both trifling as hell, and God still used them. But as beautiful as Psalm 51 seems, and as powerful as Galatians 5 may be to some, why would we allow words men wrote in their most vulnerable state to become the standard by which we shape our lives? Nathan confronted David about the liberties he'd taken with Bathsheba, her subsequent pregnancy, and the murder of her husband to cover it up. Realizing his foolishness had been aired out, David cries he was born into sin and shaped in iniquity. I get why he said it. He'd done some really treacherous stuff. But why does David, having been a murderous thought, make me sinful at birth? And then there's Paul. We know his story. He persecuted the burgeoning church, God changed his life, and he became one of the greatest saints to ever live. That's great for him, but he literally killed Christians. His victims are still dead, and nothing can change that. I've always believed Paul's overzealousness was his attempt to reckon with the harm of his painful past. I can understand that. Still, his testimony ain't mine. Why do I have to form my faith on the basis of the words of trifling men? So, just putting that out there.